From the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance at Brown University, this is the Rhodes Centre podcast. I'm the Centre's Director and your host, Mark Blythe. There are still many hurdles to addressing the climate crisis, but in case you missed it, there's been one relatively bright spot in the last decade. The price of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power, has dropped dramatically. By many measures, they're now cheaper to produce than fossil fuels. So does that mean when it comes to the green transition, we're set, right? I mean, obviously stuff's super cheap now, it's cheaper than coal. You swap out coal, we're good. We can just sit back and the market kind of is taking care of it, right? According to Brett Christophers, a professor at the Institute for Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University in Sweden, and author of the new book, The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet, this is sadly not the case. You see, the problem with capitalism saving the planet is that capitalism cares about profits, not costs. And as long as that's the case, it will not invest in renewables at the scale needed. Indeed, the paradox of falling prices is that it only results in rising profits if the profits can be captured as rents. But if they are competed away in competitive markets, like the kind of markets we built for electricity over the past 20 years everywhere, then falling prices may mean falling profits. And so the investment goes elsewhere. In his book, Brett lays out these and many other reasons why cheap renewable energy production won't necessarily lead to renewables dominating the energy market. In doing so, he puts the entire energy economy under the microscope and challenges the notion that the private sector will ever be able to meaningfully address the climate crisis. Here's our conversation. Hi Brett, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me.
So let me get started with this new book of yours, right? The Price is Wrong. How can you possibly say that? Prices are right all the time. That's what we learn in Econ 101 and everywhere else. But you actually are pretty skeptical of this for two reasons, right? The first one is there's a kind of assumption going around just now, and we see this in all these graphs that we see all the time, about the falling costs of renewables. That when the cost falls, people switch. You don't really think that's what actually happens in energy transitions, do you?
No, and there's a huge amount to say about that, but I'll lay out just a couple of my concerns about that way of framing things. There's a real narrative that says, let's look at past energy transitions in order to understand the drivers of the current one and why it's not happening as fast as it should. There's a number of reasons I worry a bit about this. One is transitions even the way we should be thinking about the development of energy sources in society? So there's a new book just out by, I think he's a French energy historian, and it's called More and More and More. And his basic argument is that actually energy transitions is not what happen. We have energy additions.
Right.
So we have one source of energy and we don't replace it. We simply add new sources of energy. So oil did not displace coal. We're using as much coal globally as we ever have. So we just add it on top. And actually, when you think of it that way, it's a worrying fact that renewables are not displacing fossil fuels, they are adding. So that's the first thing to say is, should we even be thinking in terms of stagism, as he calls it? Mm-hmm. Second one is to say, to the extent that we do have those stages, there's lots of reasons to think that it's not relative prices that have been the determining forces historically, even though the kind of core historiography of these transitions, if we call them that, suggests that it is. And I'm thinking in particular, although not only of the work of Andreas Malm, who's really, in his book Fossil Capital, he really kind of attacked, I think pretty persuasively, that idea that it was about relative prices. And he thinks there was something else that was going on.
So what was
there.
Something else?
He thinks it's that actually it's a question of profitability rather than prices. If we are capitalist businesses, we don't just have costs, we have revenues as well, right? And what I mean by that, it's the idea is that you will switch from one technology to another if the costs are low, but that presupposes that you're producing the same thing. And now, in the case of electricity, people might say, well, you're just producing electrons. But actually, one of the really interesting things about electricity is that different types of electricity source, solar, wind, nuclear, gas, coal, actually produce different types of electricity. They produce it with different degrees of regularity, with different degrees of reliability, on different production profiles, and all of that matters intensely to revenues. So even if you do have lower costs, you might have lower revenue. And so that's another reason to actually throw this into question and say, actually, what we need to be thinking about is revenue and cost together which is profitability.
So expected profitability, and that's always the key. I was reminded when I was reading the book of Keynes' idea of the marginal efficiency of capital, that essentially what an investor does is think about the lifetime income that would accrue from the asset, and then does a discount of that over the future, and then essentially says, is it worth it for me to do it? And that's essentially what you're saying about expected profits. So why is that in renewables much more dodgy and hard to do than it is if you're knocking up, let's say, a gas plant?
Yeah. On the theoretical side, I mean, I think there's Keynes, but you could just as equally go back to Marx and actually the classical political economists in general. Anwar Sheikh has this lovely phrase where he calls them profit side economists rather than supply side or demand side. Right. It's a really nice way of putting it. It's all about profitability, and it's about expected profitability. And it's right, I worked for 7 years in the consulting world, and that way that you say Keynes puts it, that's what happens, right? If you're looking at new investments, you forecast cash flows and you discount them back, and you look at the interest rate and you look at the discounted cash flow, and does it exceed a hurdle rate? And if it does, you go ahead with the investment. So that's what happens. So that's how we should be thinking about it, I think. So in the renewable space, I mean, I think there's lots of different components to this. And I think the way into it, for me, the way I approach this is by saying, look, this is problematic for getting renewables investments, by which I'm talking about solar and wind farm investments off the ground, for two different reasons. There are two different aspects of expected profitability that are problematic here for renewables developers. So one of these is about the volatility of profitability. It's a point about the degree to which pricing and profitability in the electricity sector is very, very volatile and very, very difficult to predict. And the way in which that volatility represents a significant hurdle to getting new renewables projects off the ground, specifically from the perspective of financing. And so to put this in very layman terms, you might be a renewables developer who is totally comfortable with the idea that electricity pricing is very difficult to predict, and you might be totally willing to accept that. But you're very unlikely to find a financial institution willing you to lend the money to get that project off the ground.
They basically can't deal with the vol, right? They will not know if they're going to get the money back, if it could be $5 a kilowatt or 50 or -5.
Exactly. And they simply will not lend significant amounts of money to a new renewables development in view of that volatility of pricing and the unpredictability of pricing. So there has to be some mechanism to stabilize future pricing and therefore future profitability. That's the volatility angle, one thing. The other thing is simply about the level of profitability in this business. And by business, I'm talking about the business of renewables deployment, setting up, developing a new wind or solar farm, owning and operating it over its useful life, and selling the power that it generates. For all sorts of interesting kind of wonky reasons, it's not a very high returns business. Never has been. That level of profitability is itself volatile, but on average and over time, you are looking at relatively low levels of returns of something in the order of, say, 5 to 7, 5 to 8% on average in terms of an internal rate of return. And in certain contexts, that might look attractive. But in other contexts, and to different types of capitalist actor that might be interested in investing in renewables, that actually doesn't look particularly attractive. So those are the two obstacles.
So let's take an example of that. You often hear that pension funds love wind farms, right? Or solar farms. And the assumption there is that interest rates are low. They're not at the moment, they are. And therefore, they can afford the high upfront costs because they've got a 20-year horizon and their liabilities are 4%. If they're making 6%, they're quids in. But the vast majority of investors are not like this. And also, if you have to raise all your capital up front and then you've got price volatility, you don't know if you're going to get money back, right?
Exactly. So that's exactly right. So there's only a certain subset of actors that are kind of attracted to that type of investment. And B, they're only attracted to it under certain sets of conditions, the most important of which is the ability to stabilize the volatility that otherwise exists. They then sell it on to another owner, such as a pension fund. And what you tend to find is that it's impossible for those developers to find a pension fund or an asset manager or whoever it might be that's willing to buy it until the debt has been raised that will enable the project to go ahead. So the pension fund's never going to fund it entirely out of equity.
Right.
They'll say, okay, we'll fund 15% of it, but you need to raise 85% of it through debt. Until you've got that financing lined up, we're not interested.
Let's go back to the notion, which is so intuitive that you have to fight against, that just simply falling costs equal higher profits.
Yeah.
Right? The bête noire in one of your chapters is this measurement called the levelized cost of electricity. Tell us what it is and tell us why it misleads us.
What the levelized cost of electricity is a measure that it's referred to ubiquitously within the energy world and within the energy economics world. And essentially what that measure does, or at least tries to do, is show the average cost of generating a unit of energy, in this case electricity. In the case of electricity, the standard metric is a kilowatt hour or a megawatt hour of electricity. And the two key technical things about this measure are, firstly, it's a measure over the lifetime of that asset. So it's saying, what's the average cost of producing a unit of electricity over the, say, 25 or 30 year period of life of this asset, a solar farm or a wind farm. And then it's a discounted levelized current cost. So it takes those future costs and discounts them to the present. So it's the current average cost of lifetime production of that energy. And people pay all sorts of attention to this metric. Now, why is it problematic? There are lots of reasons for that. And I think it's useful to think about it in terms of a hypothetical. If you're, say, a wind farm developer, and if 20 years ago you were facing a levelized cost of electricity of, say, $100 per megawatt hour on average over the life of your wind farm, and then thanks to technological developments and so on, 20 years later, your levelized cost has come down to $15 per megawatt hour. So they come down 85%. You would think, well, I'm quids in now because my costs have come down, so my profits have gone up. But of course, that depends on lots of things. And in my view, the most important thing it depends upon is your ability as an electricity generator to capture and essentially privatize the benefits of those cost reductions. But of course, there's a simple thing called competition that exists in capitalist economies, or at least in parts of capitalist economies.
And strangely, in the electricity market to the nth degree.
Particularly in electricity markets, and particularly amongst renewable energy developers. It's an incredibly competitive space in most countries. You have thousands of owners of generators generating a product which is an undifferentiated commodity that they are selling into incredibly competitive markets. And now, what happens when those cost reductions occur and generating companies try to capture the benefits of that? They fail to do so because competition effectively sees those excess profits, if you want to put it that way, get rapidly competed away and passed downstream, in large part, ultimately, to the very constituency that politicians want to see benefit from those cost reductions, which is, of course, us consumers,
right.
household consumers of electricity. If those costs won't come down, they don't want to see them privatized. They want to see that benefit households in terms of their energy bills.
Let's go back 100 years. And at that time, when we're putting out electricity grids for the first time, the idea was these are quote-unquote natural monopolies. And what you want is a vertically integrated firm that does power generation right through to the consumer with all the intervening steps. And then you regulated the hell out of them to make sure that they got just enough profit to keep going.
Yep.
And to keep the capital stock alive.
Yep.
And then that was it. That was the gig. And then, particularly in the EU, which is the case I know the most about, but also the United Kingdom and others, then came the deregulatory fervor, which was essentially, well, this is ridiculous. We could lower the cost here through competition. So you unbundle this thing and you have the generators on their own, and then you have the different parts of the supply chain, so to speak. And then you end up with ruthless competition to the point that nobody actually can make any money out of it unless you've got a certain degree of monopoly, which is what the fossil guys have.
Yes.
But you don't have that on the green side, right?
Yeah. Well, you have it on the fossil side upstream, I would say. Not necessarily, in processing or wherever else it might be. You definitely have it upstream, but you certainly don't have it in electricity generation, and you certainly don't have it in renewable electricity generation. So one of the questions here is like, well, have we actually historically migrated away from an industry model, a structural model of vertical integration that actually we would have been better off having.
It would have been far easier to do a transition if you already had natural monopolies that you could tell them what to do, right?
A, that's true. And B, also, it's like, well, if you are a vertically integrated entity, think about it in these terms, and you're thinking, well, I need to supply my customer base with a certain amount of electricity, and I have two different potential sources of that electricity, I'll go for the cheaper one.
Right.
But if you have separate entities distributed through the supply, you have a separate generating sector, then that kind of, the possibility for that kind of joined up, coordinated thinking doesn't really exist anymore. So I think we've migrated away from a system that actually would have been much more conducive to a rapid transition.
Right. So in a way, liberalization, once again, has had a fantastic unintended consequence. The intended consequence is stuff got cheaper, but what it also meant was, and therefore there's far less profits. And if you have all these upfront costs, etc., and the financing constraints we talked about, that creates a big problem. One of the other things that I picked, there's so much in the book, and I want to go through the particulars of this argument, because I think it's intuitive that people go, okay, it's not costs, it's just profits. Yeah, that makes sense. Why does geography matter for profits?
It matters enormously for profits. So the levelized cost of energy metric includes some costs, but not other costs. It is a generating cost. It's the cost of producing something, in this case, electricity. Right. So one of the things that you see wherever you look in the world, like electricity sectors and renewables look different in different parts of the world. They get produced by different kinds of companies and so on and so forth for different reasons. But there's one incredibly consistent feature that you see whether you're looking at India or China or the US or the UK or Germany or Sweden, where I live, is that there's a very prevalent geographic clustering of renewables facilities, so solar and wind farms, precisely in those parts of countries where people don't live. And the reason for this comes down predominantly to land costs. So one of the things that's very distinctive about solar and wind that people often don't like to talk about is that, in general, solar and wind farms take an enormous amount of land, and land in some parts of some countries costs a lot of money. You either have to lease the land or you have to buy the land. So all other things being equal, and they're not always equal, but all other things being equal, any renewables developer, to minimize its costs, will always want to locate where land is cheapest. So take the US, the cost of land in Montana or Wyoming is like 1% on average of the cost of land in New Jersey.
Right.
Okay. It's a huge difference. And so that's what they do. And so, you know, in the UK, they're all up in Scotland. In Sweden, they're all up in the north of Sweden. They're precisely where the demand for electricity is not located. Now, of course, that's different for conventional power plants. Many people will know from, you know, the smokestacks and so on, that actually, historically, conventional power plants have often been located very, very close to centres of demand. Now, the thing is, the cost of running the grid, maintaining it, investing in it, and so on, are shared across all participants in the electricity industry, both on the generator side and on the consumer side. So household electricity bill, you pay for power being produced, you pay for it being transported. Generators also pay costs to have their electricity transported to where it's consumed. That cost is not included in the levelized cost of electricity, but actually, for many of them, it's a bigger cost than the generating cost. And of course, if you locate yourself a long way away from where people and industry are located, you will have, on the one hand, a pretty low generating cost because you have very low land costs. But on the other hand, if the grid operator requires you to bear the cost of your locational decision, you will have a very high transportation cost. Now, grid operators very rarely require generators to bear the full cost of their decision, but they require them to bear a significant amount of it. So here's the thing. You can't have your cake and eat it. As a generator, as a renewables generator, you either locate where land is cheap, and therefore you have a wonderful look at my lovely, shiny, low levelized cost. Isn't my electricity cheap? But hang on a second. I have this really expensive transportation cost to get the electricity to where it's needed. Or you locate very close to where people are located, and the grid operator rewards you for that with very low transmission charges, But oh look, my levelized cost is very, very high. So that in and of itself, the levelized cost of electricity doesn't show you anything really.
Here's another one that stuck out for me in the book. How can an old coal plant near the end of its life be more profitable than a new solar farm, given the fact that relative costs dictate that coal is now more expensive than solar?
The very idea that levelized cost comparisons is something that capitalist actors that are looking at investing in energy factor in and think about is actually just simply kind of beyond the point. And the reason for that is that what you typically don't have is developers that are sitting down thinking, I'm going to build a new power plant and I'm choosing between coal and renewables. That's just not what happens. You will, in the case of renewables, for example, you have renewables developers. And the decision is not coal or wind, it's renewable plant or no renewables plant. But the second point is this, which is to think about when in the lifetime costs are incurred. And the reality, of course, is that for the most part, renewables plants, in terms of their competitiveness, are not competing with new fossil fuel power plants. They are competing, when they're selling their electricity, with power plants that in many cases have been around for decades, the costs of which have already, for the most part, been incurred. And so there's very different levels of cost that are involved here at different parts of the lifetimes. And it's that simple point that you are competing with a plant where the costs have already been sunk, they've already been incurred, which again means that those levelized cost metrics, which do look at lifetime costs, are actually not that relevant, again, when we're looking at point-in-time comparisons.
Specifically when I'm the renewable sector and I've got all those upfront costs that we spoke about already.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about the way in which, at least in highly deregulated markets, electricity is actually traded. Because we start with the generators. We just did a little bit there on sort of the people who shove it around the transportation network. Let's get to how it's actually traded. This was, I have to say, it's a very brave chapter to write, because God, is this technical.
Yeah.
But it's really worth getting through it, right? So there's a couple of terms in here: the spot market, merit order dispatch. Can you just give us a quick overview? It's like, what is this thing? How does it work? Why do we have it?
Yeah. And if you're like a nerd like me, this stuff's awesome. I love this stuff, but I'm not like a particularly normal person. But basically the way it works, and as you say, you made the important point, is we are talking about liberalized markets here, not markets in which you still have regulated, vertically integrated monopolies. We're talking about liberalized markets where you have competing generators and you have competing resellers of that electricity who meet in the market, right? So you have generators selling into the so-called spot market, and then you have the companies that we households interact with, the retailers, who are buying that power in that market. Electricity retailers are just glorified traders. They're buying at one price and selling at another. That's what they are. To somewhat simplify a complicated picture is this: the role of the grid operator is to balance supply and demand. If you don't have a balance of the amount of electricity that's being put onto the grid and that which is being taken off the grid, you're in trouble. You're going to get blackouts. The grid's going to
burnouts.
Exactly. So their job is to balance it. And so for any particular half hour or hour slot in time, the grid operator will have a pretty decent sense of how much demand is going to be. And so what happens is the market operates primarily on a day ahead basis. And so what happens is that for every half hour slot, it typically is, the next day, the grid operator says, okay, I have this much demand that I know we're going to have, pretty much. And then it says to all the different generators that are out there within the particular relevant geographic region, how much power will you be able to generate and put on the grid for that half hour period? And what price will you sell it for? What price are you willing to sell it for? What's your bid price? And so all the generators do their bids for each half hour period. With renewables, it's not that clear because the wind might not be as forecast and the sun might not be as forecast. So on the day itself, there's a balancing mechanism, it's called, to kind of iron things out, both on the demand and supply side. But let's assume their forecasts are right. So they bid into the market. And basically what the grid operator does is it takes all those bids and it stacks them on top of one another, right? At the bottom, it puts the cheapest bid, and then it goes up the so-called bid stack, and it goes all the way up that stack in ascending order of bid price until it has a cumulative amount of supply to match the cumulative amount of demand that it knows it's likely to have for that half-hour period. So typically, the cheapest bids in any market will typically be the renewables guys. Mm-hmm. Then you'll get coal, assuming there is coal. Then you'll get natural gas. Mm-hmm. And then at the top, you'll normally have nuclear. Nuclear is the most expensive typically. And so if you're in a part of the world where, for example, one day it's really windy period and there's not much demand, it might well be the case that the grid operator only has to go so far up in the bid stack that wind suppliers will supply all the electricity. Right. Because it's windy and there's not much demand. But if suddenly there's no wind and there's no sun and there's a shitload of demand because it's cold or whatever else it might be, or hot, they will have to go all the way up the bid stack, potentially all the way up to nuclear. Now, here's the thing, is that it goes up to that and it takes the so-called marginal provider, the marginal supplier, which is the last bid it has to take to meet cumulative demand. And it looks at the bid price for that marginal supplier, which if it's a wind supplier might be $10 per megawatt hour. If it's nuclear, might be $100 per megawatt hour. And it says, okay, I will accept all the bids up to that marginal bid, and I'm going to give them all the same price.
Doesn't that make the renewables at the bottom of the stack much more profitable?
Yes and no. Yes.
I thought it was too good to be true. Yeah. Tell me how.
Well, so yes, it does, insofar as...
I mean, I'm producing at 10, I'm selling at 100, I got 90, I'm quids in, right?
Absolutely. So yes, it does. But the point is that the single price that everyone gets is that marginal price. So it's the price of the last bid that is accepted that everyone gets. So yes, if it's nuclear, it's 100, and irrespective of how much it costs you to produce that, everyone gets the same price. Right. So yes, in theory, that makes renewables really profitable, at least at those moments when that happens, which doesn't always happen. And actually, as many listeners will know, there was a big old energy crisis, particularly in Europe, but not only in Europe, in 21, 22, where this was what happened, right? Was that you had, because of what was going on in Ukraine, shortage of natural gas supplies, you had a real spike in natural gas and other commodity prices. And therefore, at the times of day when natural gas was the marginal unit of supply, suddenly you had very high gas prices and therefore very high electricity prices. And everyone said, well, look, these renewables guys, their costs are really, really low, but suddenly they're getting these hugely inflated prices for their electricity, which bear no comparison to their costs. They're making enormous windfall profits. Well, yes and no. So yes, if they were selling at that price, for those moments of the time when that was happening, that was true. But here's the thing, right, which is that the number of renewables generators that are actually in practice earning money at that spot price is actually quite limited, because the volatility we talked about earlier means they can't get their projects off the ground if it will be the case that they are selling at that spot price. So actually, to get their projects off the ground, they have to find some mechanism of long-term stabilization of the price at which they will sell their power, which means that they're actually often not selling at that electricity price at all. So what happened, for example, in the UK during the energy crisis was government said, okay, we're going to levy windfall taxes on these renewable generators because they must be making windfall profits. But when they actually began to look at it, they found, actually they're not, because they are supported by certain mechanisms, which mean that they're actually not selling at that price at all. But that's basically the way the market works. And what it means, of course, is that you can get these enormous swings in volatility, because 1 minute, the market price, the clearing price, is being set by renewables, who might be bidding at most $10 per megawatt hour. But during an energy crisis, the next hour, the marginal price can be set by a nuclear plant or a gas-fired plant where the cost is $500 per megawatt hour. So it swings wildly.
So with those swings, you've got a problem, particularly on the renewable side.
Yes.
We've spoken about the volatility before. But there's also that phenomena where you get negative prices in these markets. What's that all about?
Yeah. So in exactly these types of markets we're talking about, there has been an increasing frequency in recent years of moments during which the bid price, the clearing bid price is negative. And that can happen for a variety of different reasons. Let me just throw out two. The first of those would be that if you are for example, a nuclear facility, and you can dispatch a given and predictable amount of power, there is a cost to you, not just in terms of the fuel, for example, but there is a significant cost involved in terms of essentially switching on and switching off your power. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that you might be willing, say over a 3-hour period, if you want to sell in period 1 and 3 at very positive prices, you might be willing to incur a very low price or even potentially a negative price during the hour in the middle,
because you can't stop,
so as to avoid the cost of switching off.
Right.
This happens even in the fossil fuel world, but it happens particularly in the renewables world. In many countries around the world, the types of subsidies that governments have offered to try to incentivize renewables development mean that you're essentially getting a subsidy to the price at which the market clears. The way to think about it on the renewables side is this. Say you have a cost of $40 to deliver a particular megawatt hour of electricity, but say you are getting a $50 per megawatt hour subsidy from the government. Well, you can successfully sell your electricity at -$5 per megawatt hour because you're still making a profit from that. So it's a function predominantly of the nature of the subsidies that exist in this market, that you can sell your electricity at a negative price and still make profits because of the subsidy that exists.
But in the aggregate, that must depress prices. So you've got a double whammy with the volatility,
yes.
right? So we've got our original financing problem, big upfront costs, and we don't know how much we're going to get back because it's too volatile.
Exactly.
Right? Then we've got our second step in that one, which is essentially the spot market that we spoke about. And the spot market basically means you've got these very high prices that in theory you could get, but the chances are you're not going to get it because you're not there at the right time.
Exactly.
It's latency issues, it's geography issues, all those sorts of things, the financing thing. And then we come back to it and basically, well, if we are there and we're in the mix, what we're going to do, given our subsidy structure, is we're going to drag the price down.
Yes.
And while, again, that might be good for the end consumer, it's actually crap for the industry if you want to roll it out.
Yeah, that's what's referred to in the industry as price cannibalization. The greater the level of renewables penetration across a grid, and therefore the more of the time that renewables are essentially setting the market price, the less good that is for future renewables investment because it's a lower price. So it's like the success of renewables cannibalizing the future of renewables by virtue, paradoxically, of their own success.
So if you follow that through, it's not just that the issue isn't costs, it is profit. It's that when you're making a profit, you're actually lowering your costs to the point that you're harming the profit even further.
Yes, exactly.
Wow. See, people are not thinking this through, are they, when they just look at that graph of all those costs falling?
No, which is why I kind of say you should ignore the levelized cost of energy completely, because it really doesn't tell you anything very significant.
So let's get to sort of like come out from this a little bit and just go to finish up with a couple of macro questions, right? So given this profit volatility and price volatility, if you think about the subsidies, we haven't really spoken about them, but, you know, feed-in tariffs, etc. The way you basically, you're bribing people or producers by subsidizing their cost of capital, which is implicitly, if not explicitly, basically a profit guarantee, right? And this industry cannot live without them.
No.
So can we just sort of admit that's the world that we're in and kind of work around this profit problem by just saying, look, we need to do this? We do this all the time. Healthcare in America, right? I mean, it's not a market, it's just subsidies, right? Defense industrial complex, right? You know, these things are massively subsidized. We subsidize everything. Why not just admit this is what's going on and just subsidize the hell out of it and get it done?
I mean,
isn't that the IRA to a certain extent?
Yeah, that is exactly the IRA. And what I was going to say before you said that is that, I mean, essentially that's what we are doing.
Right.
We are admitting that, I think, implicitly.
But it's still not working then, right?
Well, no. And I think that there are lots of different reasons for that. Many parts of the world, governments don't have the capacity to provide that level of support, right? I mean, the US government can do it, fine. But if you're in Vietnam or Senegal or Namibia, different challenge.
Anybody with a real current account constraint, not really easy to do this.
So that's one thing. Second thing, I think, is that not least because of the kind of hegemony of the narrative of levelized costs, governments have been led to believe, in fact told by many economists, that they won't need to provide subsidies indefinitely. That as those costs come down, they will be able to essentially attenuate those subsidies and even remove them. and that renewables will stand on their own 2 feet. Now, when they've tried to do that, they found it doesn't work. Investment collapses. But there's still this lingering belief that you shouldn't have to subsidize them.
Right.
Right.
I think just to tie a bow on that, this sort of brings together everything we've been talking about, right? Because of everything from volatility to geography to latency, the whole lot. Well, you have a thing that isn't like the other things. They're all moving electrons, but one of them's kind of got a lot of upfront costs and has a lot of fragilities, if you want to put it that way, right?
Exactly.
And even if that gets really cheap, you still have all those problems and you still have all those fragilities.
Yeah.
So when you pull out the subsidy, you got even less chance of it being financed.
Yes. So in answer to your question, shouldn't we just admit that? Well, A, we sort of already are in some parts of the world, but B, not everywhere can do it. And C, it depends what your range of alternatives that you think are politically and economically viable come down to, is the way I would put it. So if, for example, you were to say to me, look, here's the choice. On the one hand, we continue to subsidize BlackRock and co. in perpetuity to build the renewables we need to help wean the world off fossil fuels. And that means nice fat profits for BlackRock. A, that's the one choice. The other one is we take a kind of what you might think of as a kind of a leftist politically pure position. We say, no, we can't swallow that.
Yes.
We don't want to do that. Let's not provide that de-risking. Mm-hmm. And because we don't find that politically tolerable, and then what happens is the investment doesn't take. I will take option A every day of the week. Right.
But there's an option C, which is, to bring it home, why don't we just own it ourselves?
Well, that's the thing.
These are not difficult technologies. These are known technologies.
No. And that's the argument, right? Which is that shouldn't be the range of potential opportunities. There is another way to do this. And of course, if BlackRock doesn't think that 5 to 7% internal rate of return is sufficient to justify betting the house on renewables, then it should be more than sufficient for the public sector. It's not like you would, as the public sector, you would be borrowing to finance assets that don't generate a return.
Right.
This is revenue generating assets that wash their face, which that should be sufficient for the public sector.
So if the public sector is borrowing at 3% real and is earning 6%, you can make the argument that you're putting assets on the balance sheet that reduce the debt stock.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I've been making this argument for years, right? And yet we now have a chancellor in the UK who some of us thought at least might take some of this on board, but governments seem to be just unable to take that on board. The notion that they can own the assets that earn a return, which would then be balance sheet positive, which would reduce their debt rather than adding to it, and then would give us security of supply going forward.
Yeah, and keep household bills relatively low for energy.
Why is it so difficult for them to make that leap?
Yeah, I have no idea. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. To my mind, for certain parts of the world, that is the obvious, logical way to speed things up. Lots of people don't like hearing this, but let's look at China. Mm-hmm. That China is a significant different case from the rest of the world insofar as two things. One, when it comes to renewables, it's not the same political economy. So 95% or so of wind energy development in China is in the hand of state-owned enterprises who are borrowing from state-owned finance institutions whose debt is subsidized by a state-owned central bank. And all of this is being directed to one extent or another by Beijing and or provincial authorities. It's a state-led project. And 65% of renewable capacity investment in 2023 globally was in China.
Right. And
95% of the increment in investment in 2023 on 2022 was in China. And to me, that's not a coincidence that the public-led one is the one that's doing it, and the countries that are dependent on private investment and therefore the profit imperative are the ones that are disproportionately struggling. It's clearly the case that only some parts of the world and only some sovereigns have the credible capacity for that type of borrowing and investment that we're talking about here. So it's not a universally applicable solution by any stretch of the imagination.
But just as a thought, to go back to the UK as an example of someone that's kind of in between these two situations, that is to say, they're not the United States or China, but they're not sort of like someone who's utterly debt dependent or so on and so forth, right? So, back to the question of why they don't seem to think this through. I'm persuaded by an argument that's been made by Dan Davies. He has this great idea of sort of like when you have a state, for example, and you start to hang out with consultants and they start to do things, or if you privatize things, what you do is you take that thing, whatever it is, and you put it beyond the informational boundary of the state. And then if you decide later on to take it back, you can't, or at least it's really difficult to do, because the people who knew what this thing was have been retasked, moved on, or retired. And also the state itself has changed in such a way that it's really hard to interface this back in.
Yeah.
So what you think are revisable choices actually become kind of like structural logics that are very hard to reverse.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's the case that sort of not just the neoliberalization of markets has made the transition harder, the neoliberalization of the state has made it harder as well.
Yeah. I mean, I buy that. I mean, I think that, well, yes, that's true, but public ownership and investment in something like renewable energy, it doesn't demand a huge amount of expertise. You know, you're not saying the public sector needs to build it. You can just contract. I mean, that's the New Deal, right? In the US was publicly owned infrastructure, but it was private contractors that built it, and it would be exactly the same. Get the private sector to build it, but not own it and operate it. It doesn't take rocket science to actually do this sort of thing. And of course, you don't necessarily have to get the public sector to do it, but the public sector has to be able to conceive of the possibility of doing it. And the limited amount of interaction I've had with people advising policymakers on not least energy is that you're talking about a constituency that to a significant extent doesn't really know what it's talking about when it comes to these sorts of things. They're just not informed. And to the extent that they are informed, they're informed by people who are telling them about levelized cost of energy. And so there is this kind of, you know, even if there was a different attitude within governments like the UK's to things like investing in revenue generating assets, even then I think you would face a challenge which is related to the limited understanding of what's going on in the energy world.
So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we have.
Let's leave it there. Great to talk to you, Brett.
Thanks, Mark.
This episode was produced by Dan Richards and Zach Hirsch, with production assistance from Sabrina Klumek. If you like this episode, leave us a rating and a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And be sure to subscribe to the show while you're at it. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Road Centre podcast. Thanks for listening.